Lori and Larry met when they both had a couple of failed marriages and several children behind them. But they were able to bring a wonderful feeling with them over the years. And on the morning of February the 10th, before Valentine's Day, they had a romantic date that cost one of them his life. Larry and Lori Isenberg had just returned from Florida to Idaho, where the man had crossed a few items off his bucket list. He wanted to watch the shuttle launch, ride in a fan boat, and learn to sail. In the cold mornings of February 13th, 2018, Larry, 68, and his wife Lori, 64, woke up early to watch the sunrise. They took their motorboat out into the calm waters of Lake Coeur, Idaho, to enjoy the first rays of sunshine at a picturesque spot called Sam Bay before heading to an exclusive resort for breakfast. Unfortunately, these wishes could not come true. Just a few hours later, at 10:25, the Costanay County Sheriff's Office received an alarm call. The woman's voice broke into a scream. She choked with sobs. But when she calmed down a bit, she was able to explain to the 911 dispatcher what had happened. Larry and Lori Isenberg had been together for 17 years. They each had several children from previous relationships. But still, they never argued, and were always looking for a reason to praise each other. Relatives and friends spoke of them as a wonderful couple who could carry their love through the years. On the eve of Valentine's Day, the man was in a romantic mood. He considered every day to be the best day of his life. He always appeared everywhere with a smile on his face. That morning, Larry sent a photo of the sunrise to his daughter before he left and texted a friend that the fishing trip was canceled because he was feeling a little under the weather. The Isenberg couple boarded the boat. Larry started the engine and the boat carried them gently rocking on the water towards the sun. They were already quite far from the shore when the engine suddenly stopped. The man went to the bow of the boat to see what had happened to the engine. Suddenly Larry got dizzy and fell overboard into the freezing water. Lori, who hadn't expected anything like this, became agitated and rushed to his aid. But she stumbled, fell and hit her head on the heater. Blood began to flow from her nose. When she got up, her husband was nowhere to be found. He had apparently disappeared into the dark water. Attempts to find the cell phone were unsuccessful. Then Lori tried to start the engine, but when Larry crashed, he apparently broke the ignition switch and had to start the engine manually. The distraught wife circled the spot where her husband had fallen into the water. As she gazed into the mirror surface of the lake, desperately trying to find him, she was afraid to swim any further or return to shore lest she lose her bearings. She even pressed the boat horn several times to get someone's attention. When Lori realized that everything was useless, she felt cold all over her body. She pulled out the blanket and saw her husband's cell phone. By the time she called the emergency services, about 2 hours had passed since Larry disappeared into the freezing water. After the call, Lori lowered her hand hopelessly and the phone slipped overboard. Shortly after 11 o'clock, officers deployed to the nearby shore and sent a rescue boat to bring the distraught woman ashore and provide medical care while the Isenbergs' boat was towed for further investigation. And although at first glance it all looked like a tragic accident, the police had to make sure there was no evidence of foul play. Larry was probably dead after more than 2 hours in the water. Survival in such harsh conditions is almost impossible. The task now was to reproduce a detailed picture of the incident and verify the veracity of the woman's words. Upon entering the boat, investigators immediately noticed blood spatter in several places, presumably due to the woman's nosebleed, despite Lori's statement that the ignition switch was faulty. Just before Larry went underwater, police found a switch, and the cord on the floor struck investigators as odd, because for the engine to start, the switch and belt must be attached to the ignition switch. In addition, the ignition key was clearly bent, indicating a possible struggle. The police also searched Lori's bags. Several keys and an empty juice bottle were found in her handbags. All items were confiscated as evidence, and the boat was taken to a nearby parking lot for storage. The truck used by the Isenbergs to tow the boat was also inspected. However, nothing of note was found there. One of the officers noticed Lori's lost cell phone and a bottle of allergy medication on the center console. It was an over-the-counter medication. The search for Larry Isenberg in the water was complicated by the fact that he was wearing dark clothing, and Lori did not know exactly where the boat was when the man fell overboard. This significantly expanded the search area. Instead of a rescue diver, the decision was made to deploy an acoustic group. Search and rescue helicopters also flew over the lake in the hope of finding the drowned man's body, but to no avail. On the first day, the sonar rescue team spent 3.5 hours searching for Larry. Experts searched for the body in the cold waters of the lake until it became too dark to see anything. Meanwhile, one of the officers met with Lori Isenberg at the hospital where the woman was taken after the incident. He wanted to pinpoint a more specific search area, so he showed her a map of the lake and asked her to recount how Larry had fallen into the water and what exactly had happened to the boat's engine. Lori said that after a walk around the lake, her husband started saying something about the resort they were going to. He had originally planned to go fishing in the morning, but in the morning his health took a turn for the worse, so they just decided to enjoy the morning and have breakfast at the resort. At that moment, the engine cut out, and Larry went to see what the problem was. Lori herself stayed inside and watched through the glass to see what her husband was doing. Suddenly he turned around, went pale, and started to fall on his side. Apparently he was leaning on the key at the moment of the fall and it bent in the ignition. The woman thought something was wrong with his heart and rushed to his aid. If she hadn't tripped at the worst possible moment, Larry might still have been alive. Lori covered her face with her hands and was silent for a while, only her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. A few minutes later, she ran her finger over the map, but couldn't pinpoint the exact location of the tragedy. Her thoughts were confused, and she couldn't remember if there were trees or houses nearby, which side the sun was shining from. She even lost track of time as she searched for her husband in the water. In situations like this, a minute can seem like an eternity. Due to the great depth of the lake and the low water temperature, the search for the body was very difficult. First, the Sonoran team had to find the drowned person, and then, with the help of rescue divers, lift the body to the surface. As efforts to find Larry were still unsuccessful, investigators called on the Sonoran team to accompany the Sonoran group to the lake, but the woman's presence was only a nuisance. She still couldn't remember any specific landmarks. The lack of any information about whereabouts seemed odd to the investigators, but Isenberg's behavior surprised them even more. During the search work, Larry joked, laughed irrelevantly, and then suddenly began sobbing as if remembering why she was invited to the lake. Too little time had passed after the death of a loved one, and Larry couldn't seem to come to terms with the idea that her husband was no longer alive. She now felt guilty for showing positive emotions. Our paradise, that's what the Isenberg couple called their home. After her husband's death, Larry could no longer stay in the house where he had lived happily for 17 years. When the wife returned from the lake that day, she began to take action. Larry and Lori's residence was 20 minutes southwest of town. The woman invited her relatives to help move all the belongings and furniture out of the house because she wanted to sell it as soon as possible. Vigilant neighbors reported this to the police. It seemed to them that the woman was behaving strangely and suspiciously. Lori Isenberg was proud to have worked for the North Idaho Housing Coalition for many years, and only recently the chief accountant of this institution ordered an internal audit because he noticed some violations. Many employees suspected that something illegal was going on at the coalition, but when the truth came out, all employees were literally stunned. This shocking revelation piqued the interest of investigators, and gave the investigation a whole new direction. Lori Isenberg was suspected of possible fraudulent activity. It involved the theft of coalition funds amounting to $500,000. The woman was suspended and threatened with dismissal. Everyone who knew her couldn't believe what was happening. Lori had no criminal record. She and her husband were not poor. All these accusations seemed like some kind of monstrous mistake. Sensing that something was wrong, Larry's children asked permission to speak to the investigators about their concerns. They expressed concerns about going to the lake at this time of year. Also, their father was not going fishing because he was unwell. Then Dean, Larry's son, talked about Lori's strange behavior in the last few days after her father's disappearance. She asked how they would divide the inheritance. Dean was very concerned about his father's death, so he just left without even discussing the subject. It seemed premature to him, as his father's body had still not been found. To somehow reassure the relatives of the deceased, the detective explained how the search was conducted. The sonar team first checked the area of maximum probability, but when this yielded no results, they scanned the water diagonally in different directions. After Larry's family left, the investigators went over all the details of the case again. And although Isenberg's wife was not among the suspects, her behavior in general raised doubts. She was able to calmly answer all the investigators' questions and explain all the details. But something about the investigation was bothering the investigators. The next day, a search was carried out at the Isenberg house in connection with Lori's fraud allegations. And on the following February, the woman was arrested on 40 counts of forgery and 1 count of grand theft at the non-profit North Idaho Housing Coalition, where she had previously worked as executive director. Her bail was set at US, which was immediately posted by one of her daughters. But the startling discovery happened literally a day later. On March 1st through 3 weeks later, after Larry Isenberg suddenly plunged from his boat into the icy waters of Lake Coeur, the body of a man was found floating face down near the shore, about 5 kilometers from the scene of his wife's reported accident. No suspicious injuries were found on the body, and based on the drowned man's clothing, it was likely that the search was ultimately successful. The body was pulled from the water and sent for further examination. An autopsy confirmed that it was Larry Isenberg, but the coroner also found out the cause of death. It turned out that Larry did not die in the water, as no signs of drowning were found. Toxicology tests found lethal levels of an antihistamine in his body, which is used to fight allergies and suppress some cold symptoms. This drug works very quickly, but can only be fatal in rare cases if too much is taken in a short period of time. Larry's antihistamine dose exceeded the norm by a factor of 70. Therefore, according to the coroner, Isenberg died before he fell into the water. Authorities decided not to immediately release the autopsy results. In an earlier statement to police, Lori mentioned that her husband took a number of different pills each day, then forgot and took them again, often mixing up the dosages. It is possible that the wife was telling the absolute truth, but it is also possible that she gave this information in advance, in case the body was found, and a lethal dose of drugs was discovered in the body. Lori also insisted that Larry had not been entirely healthy recently, and had complained of feeling unwell, but all the other relatives unanimously asserted the opposite. The only time Isenberg mentioned his illness was in a text message to a friend the morning before he disappeared, assuming he sent the text message himself. An experienced analyst determined that the last time Larry's phone was used near Lori's son's home was after Isenberg's disappearance, although the woman claimed she threw the cell phone in the water immediately after calling emergency services. Lori could not explain how the phone could have been used after that. Her son from a previous marriage had also sworn and swore that he had never held Larry's cell phone in his hand. At the end of May, Lori did not appear at the hearing in the fraud case. As it turned out, the woman was trying to avoid punishment. Isenberg quickly fled the area and was on the run for about 2 months before she surrendered to authorities in July. Detectives working on the case of Larry Isenberg's mysterious death at the time questioned colleagues and acquaintances of the deceased. They learned that cracks were beginning to appear in the couple's ideal relationship. Although Lori and Larry seemed to be a happy couple, in recent months the man had often complained to his friends about his wife's excessive spending. He didn't like the fact that a large portion of their joint savings went to support Lori's children, who were long independent adults. Investigators also learned that Lori was a rather frivolous woman. She easily cheated on her first husband with 3 different men, including Isenberg, and while this was in the past, it still didn't provide a particularly flattering description of Larry's wife. The issue of betrayal was also raised on the board of the Housing Coalition, but the next discovery could serve as a concrete motive for the crime. Investigators discovered changes to Larry's will that had been made by none other than Lori. The handwritten changes were made about a month before his death. According to the new will, it turned out that 80% of the inheritance did not go to his own children, but to 6 stepdaughters, Lori Isenberg's daughters from another marriage. It is not known what the woman was counting on when she made these changes. Eventually, authorities released the autopsy results and called this case a full investigation into a particularly serious crime in which a person died. Investigators even spoke to Isenberg's doctor, who said that Larry was perfectly healthy for his age. He was never prescribed a drug that later proved fatal. Based on all the evidence gathered, police believed that Lori had mixed an excessive dose of medication into the juice bottle. Larry drank the contents and fell overboard from the effects of the toxic drug not far from the shore where he was found. Lori immediately used a trolling motor to move the boat away from the area before calling 911. Neither spouse appeared to have life insurance, which is often a motive for such crimes. Investigators learned, however, that there was an agreement between the couple. If one of them died, the other would become the owner of the joint property. Lori intended to use the money to pay off the Housing Coalition. At the time of his death, Larry did not know that his wife was involved in fraud at her workplace, and she did it all to help her daughters financially. At least, that's what she told her children. 2 months later, in July of the same year, Lori was tired of hiding because she knew she would be found sooner or later anyway. She contacted the sheriff's office herself. She said she was simply living with her family in California. Earlier this year, Lori and her 4 daughters admitted to committing fraud involving the use of electronic communications and pleaded guilty to the charges. Lori Isenberg was sentenced to 5 years in prison, and her daughters received 3 years probation and several hours of community service, as well as a fine of more than $USD. While Lori was in prison for fraud, the investigation into her husband's strange death continued. Investigators checked the search history on the woman's phone and found incriminating evidence. While Larry enjoyed their trip to Florida together, Lori studied depth charts and articles about drownings and boating accidents. Finally, in February of the year, while still in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement, Lori was indicted for the willful death of her husband, Larry Isenberg. Lori, 67, appeared in court in May 2021 for sentencing. She denied to the end that the crime was planned and tried to portray everything as an accident, but the jury did not believe the woman, and Lori Isenberg was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole only after 30 years. Are the daughters of a selfish woman involved in the story of a man's death? Will forever remain a mystery.